The sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Wasco, Texas, as Florence Sullivan clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new life had turned to bitter ashes in her mouth. Her family home in Boston, once filled with laughter and security, was now just a painful memory after her father's business failed, and the consumption took both her parents within months of each other. Florence stared at the weathered sign of the Wasco General Store, her stomach hollow with hunger and her pride nearly as empty. 3 days without a proper meal had left her light-headed, her once fine dress now travel-stained and worn thin at the elbows. At 22, she had traveled as far west as her dwindling inheritance would allow, chasing rumors of employment opportunities for educated women. Instead, she found a rough frontier town with little use for her refined penmanship or knowledge of literature. "You gonna buy something or just block the doorway all day, miss?" The gruff voice of the shopkeeper startled her from her thoughts. Florence straightened her back, summoning what remained of her dignity. "I was hoping to inquire about employment opportunities, sir." The shopkeeper's laugh was harsh. "Employment, for a woman like you?" His eyes traveled over her once fine clothes and delicate hands that had never known hard labor. "Unless you're looking to work at Madame Ruby's at the edge of town, there ain't much call for." "I am most certainly not," Florence interrupted, heat rising to her cheeks. She had heard whispers of Madame Ruby's establishment during her short time in Wasco, and though desperation clawed at her, there were lines she would not cross. "Then I can't help you, miss." The shopkeeper turned away, attending to a customer who actually had money to spend. Florence stepped back into the harsh sunlight, blinking away tears of frustration. Her lodgings at the town's only boarding house were paid through tonight, but tomorrow she would have nowhere to go. The last of her coins would barely buy a meal, let alone secure another night's shelter. As she walked down the dirt street, the rumble of approaching horses drew her attention. A wagon pulled up outside the general store, driven by a broad-shouldered man whose face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. 2 ranch hands rode alongside, their conversation drifting toward her on the hot Texas breeze. "Mr. Vance needs to find himself a wife before he works himself into an early grave," one said to the other. "Good luck with that. What woman wants to live all the way out at Starlight Ranch?" "Might as well be on the moon." Florence paused, her mind racing. Starlight Ranch. She had heard it mentioned, one of the largest cattle operations in the county, owned by a man who rarely came to town. And now he was here, perhaps within earshot of her desperate situation. Before she could reconsider, Florence approached the wagon. The driver looked down at her, pushing his hat back to reveal a weathered face that spoke of long days under the punishing Texas sun. Though he couldn't be more than 30, lines creased the corners of eyes the color of a summer sky. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I couldn't help but overhear your men talking. Are you Mr. Vance of Starlight Ranch?" The man's expression remained impassive as he studied her. "I am. Miles Vance, and you are?" "Florence Sullivan, sir." "Recently arrived from Boston." She drew a deep breath. "Mr. Vance, I understand this is terribly forward, but I find myself in difficult circumstances. I'm educated, capable, and desperately in need of employment and shelter." Miles Vance's eyebrows rose slightly. "The ranch isn't hiring governesses, Miss Sullivan. We need ranch hands who can break horses and drive cattle." "I wasn't suggesting," Florence faltered, then straightened her spine. Desperation made her bold. "Your men mentioned you need a wife, I need a home. Perhaps we could come to an arrangement that benefits us both." Miles stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Florence felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she held his gaze. Better this than starvation or worse. You proposing marriage, Miss Sullivan, to a man you've just met?" His voice was low, tinged with disbelief. "I'm proposing a practical solution, Mr. Vance. I need a roof over my head, and you apparently need someone to manage your household. I assure you I'm capable." He studied her for another long moment. "Can you cook?" "Yes," Florence lied. She had observed her family's cook often enough to have a basic understanding, though she'd never actually prepared a meal herself. "Do hard work from sunup to sundown. I'm not afraid of labor, Mr. Vance." A hint of amusement flickered in his eyes. "Yet those hands have never seen a day's work in their life." Florence tucked her hands behind her back. "Circumstances change, sir, as do people when necessity demands it." Miles Vance glanced at his ranch hands, who were pretending not to listen while loading supplies. Then he looked back at Florence, taking in her desperate eyes and proud posture. "Get in the wagon, Miss Sullivan," he said finally. "We'll discuss terms on the ride to Starlight." Florence didn't hesitate. With nothing but the clothes on her back and a small valise containing her few remaining possessions, she climbed onto the wagon seat beside Miles Vance, ignoring the speculative glances from townspeople witnessing this strange arrangement. As they pulled away from Wasco, Florence stared straight ahead, not daring to look back at the town that had offered her nothing but rejection. Her heart hammered in her chest. Had she just made the greatest mistake of her life, or its salvation? "I should warn you, Miss Sullivan," Miles said as they left the town behind, "Starlight isn't Boston. It's 10 miles to the nearest neighbor, 30 to town. Winters are harsh, summers harsher." "I understand," Florence replied, though in truth she couldn't imagine such isolation. "And I should be clear about what I expect," he continued. "This would be a marriage in name and legal standing only. I need someone to cook, clean, and keep house. Not," he cleared his throat, "not a true wife." Florence felt a curious mixture of relief and something like disappointment. "I understand completely, Mr. Vance. I'm seeking shelter, not romance." Miles nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Then we have an understanding. We'll be married by Judge Parker when he makes his circuit next week. Until then, you'll stay in the guest room. My housekeeper, Mrs. Hattie, will show you around and help you settle in." "You have a housekeeper?" Florence couldn't hide her surprise. "Then why? Mrs. Hattie is 73 and planning to return to her daughter in Dallas next month. She's been after me to find a replacement before she leaves." His hands tightened on the reins. "Finding permanent help willing to live so far from town has proven difficult." Florence nodded, understanding better now. She wasn't just getting a roof, she was filling a genuine need. It made the arrangement feel slightly less humiliating. "One more thing," Miles added. "Whatever brought you to this point, whatever you're running from or to, it stays in the past once you become Mrs. Vance. Starlight is a fresh start. I expect loyalty and honesty going forward." "I have nothing to hide, Mr. Vance," Florence said softly. "Just unfortunate circumstances and a desire to survive them." For the first time, Miles Vance's stern expression softened slightly. "Then we'll get along just fine, Miss Sullivan." As the wagon rumbled toward Starlight Ranch, Florence stared at the vast Texas landscape stretching endlessly before them. The enormity of what she had just done, agreeing to marry a complete stranger, threatened to overwhelm her. But when she glanced back, the town of Wasco was already disappearing into the distance, along with any other options she might have had. The land grew wilder as they traveled, scrubby plains giving way to gently rolling hills dotted with oak and mesquite trees. After about an hour, they crested a rise and Miles drew the wagon to a halt. "There it is," he said, gesturing to the vista before them. "Starlight Ranch." Florence gasped despite herself. Below them stretched a broad valley cut through with a silver ribbon of creek water. A large, two-story house of whitewashed wood stood near its center, surrounded by barns, corrals, and outbuildings. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and in the distance, horses galloped freely across an expansive meadow. "It's beautiful," she whispered, genuinely impressed by the scope of the operation. "It's taken 10 years of sweat and blood to build," Miles replied, a note of pride in his voice. "My father claimed this land when Texas was still a republic, left it to me when he died fighting Comanches in '62. I was 18, barely knew what I was doing, but I was determined not to lose it." They continued down the slope toward the ranch, and Florence felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps this desperate gamble would prove worthwhile after all. When they reached the main house, several ranch hands appeared to help unload the supplies. Florence noticed their curious glances, but appreciated that none asked questions directly. Miles helped her down from the wagon with an impersonal courtesy that somehow made her feel both relieved and oddly disappointed. "Mrs. Hattie," Miles called as they entered the house. A small, bird-like woman with iron-gray hair appeared from what Florence assumed was the kitchen. Her sharp eyes took in Florence's travel-worn appearance with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Hattie, this is Miss Florence Sullivan. She'll be staying with us and learning the household operations before you leave." Mrs. Hattie's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. "Is that so?" she said, her voice rich with a southern accent. "And in what capacity will Miss Sullivan be staying?" Miles cleared his throat. "Miss Sullivan has agreed to become my wife. We'll be married when Judge Parker comes through." Mrs. Hattie's expression cycled through shock, suspicion, and finally settled on something like resigned amusement. "Well, ain't that something? After all these years of me telling you to find a wife, you go and bring one home like she's a new saddle." She turned to Florence. "No offense meant, miss." "None taken," Florence replied, though in truth, the comparison stung. "Mrs. Hattie will show you to your room and help you get settled," Miles said. "I have work to attend to." With that, he nodded curtly and disappeared through the front door, leaving Florence alone with the housekeeper. "Well then," Mrs. Hattie said after a moment of awkward silence, "let's get you situated, shall we? You look about ready to drop, poor thing." Florence followed the older woman up a broad staircase to the second floor. The house was surprisingly well appointed for a frontier ranch, with solid furniture, polished floors, and even a few paintings adorning the walls. It spoke of success and stability, things Florence had feared she might never know again. "This here's the guest room, Mrs. Hattie said, opening a door to reveal a pleasant, sun-filled bedroom with a four-poster bed and simple but attractive furnishings. Bathrooms down the hall. We've got indoor plumbing, which is more than most ranches can say. Mr. Vance believes in modern conveniences." "It's lovely," Florence said sincerely, setting down her small valise. "Mrs. Hattie, I know this is unusual. I hope you don't think ain't my place to think anything, miss," the older woman interrupted, though not unkindly. "Mr. Vance is a good man, hard-working, fair. Keeps to himself mostly but treats everyone right." She fixed Florence with a penetrating gaze. "He deserves someone who'll treat him the same way, marriage of convenience or not." Florence swallowed. "I understand." "Good. Now get yourself cleaned up. Dinner's at 6 sharp. Mr. Vance doesn't tolerate lateness." With that, Mrs. Hattie left, closing the door behind her. Alone for the first time since making her impulsive decision, Florence sat heavily on the edge of the bed. What had she done? Agreed to marry a stranger, a rough cattleman with whom she had nothing in common. Yet as she glanced around the clean, comfortable room, a room that would be hers, at least for now, she couldn't bring herself to regret her choice. Not when the alternative had been so bleak. Florence opened her valise and removed her few remaining possessions. A change of clothes, a tattered copy of Pride and Prejudice, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a small photograph of her parents on their wedding day. She placed the photograph on the bedside table, a reminder of what real love looked like, something she had resigned herself to never experiencing. After washing away the dust of travel in the surprisingly modern bathroom, Florence changed into her cleanest dress and made her way downstairs, determined to begin learning whatever she needed to make this arrangement work. She found Mrs. Hattie in the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be an enormous meal. "I'd like to help," Florence said, rolling up her sleeves. "If I'm to take over your duties, I should start learning immediately." Mrs. Hattie eyed her skeptically. "Ever cooked for ranch hands before, Miss Sullivan?" "No," Florence admitted, "but I'm a quick learner." The older woman sighed. "Well, I suppose we'd better start with the basics. Can you peel potatoes without taking your fingers off in the process?" Florence nodded, though in truth she'd never peeled a potato in her life. The next hour proved humbling as Florence struggled with even the simplest kitchen tasks. Mrs. Hattie watched with a mixture of horror and grudging amusement as Florence's potato peels came off in chunks thick enough to feed another person. "Lord have mercy," Mrs. Hattie muttered. "Mr. Vance is gonna starve to death before Christmas." Florence bit her lip but continued working. "I'll improve, I promise. You'd better, or this'll be the shortest marriage in Texas history." Despite her words, there was a hint of kindness in Mrs. Hattie's tone. "Here, like this." She demonstrated the proper peeling technique. Smooth and even. See, by dinner time, Florence had managed to adequately prepare the potatoes and even learn the basics of biscuit making, though her first batch resembled rocks more than bread. Mrs. Hattie tactfully set those aside and used her own for the evening meal. Miles returned just as they were setting the table. He had washed up, his hair still damp at the temples, but his expression remained as unreadable as when he'd left. Two other men accompanied him, his foreman, Jake Wilcox, and his ranch manager, Tom Bradley, both of whom regarded Florence with undisguised curiosity. "Miss Sullivan," Miles said with a nod, "I trust Mrs. Hattie has made you comfortable." "Yes, thank you, Mr. Vance," Florence replied, suddenly self-conscious under the scrutiny of the other men. "Miss Sullivan has agreed to become my wife," Miles announced without preamble. "We'll be married when Judge Parker comes through next week." Jake and Tom exchanged surprised glances, but quickly offered their congratulations. "We've been telling the boss he needs a wife to look after him," Jake said with a grin. "'Bout time he listened." The dinner that followed was less awkward than Florence had feared. The men discussed ranch business while she and Mrs. Hattie served the meal. Florence noted how Miles listened carefully to his men's opinions, asking thoughtful questions and considering their advice. He might be taciturn, but he wasn't a tyrant. After the meal, when the men had retired to the porch with their coffee, Mrs. Hattie showed Florence how to properly clean and organize the kitchen for the next day's cooking. "Ranch work starts before dawn," she explained. "Breakfast needs to be ready by 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6. 20 men to feed, give or take, depending on the season." Florence felt overwhelmed but nodded determinedly. "I'll manage." "You will because you have to," Mrs. Hattie said bluntly. "But don't worry too much. I won't leave until you've got a handle on things." "Mr. Vance and I already discussed it." A wave of relief washed over Florence. "Thank you. I appreciate that more than I can say." Later that evening, as Florence prepared for bed, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Miles standing in the hallway, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "I wanted to check that you're settling in all right," he said stiffly. "Yes, thank you. Everyone has been very kind." Miles nodded. "Mrs. Hattie says you're eager to learn." "I am. A brief, awkward silence stretched between them. "Mr. Vance," Florence began hesitantly, "I want to thank you for this opportunity. I know our arrangement is unconventional, but I promise to work hard and earn my keep." Something flickered in Miles's eyes, perhaps surprise at her directness. "I'm sure you will, Miss Sullivan." He paused. "I've had papers drawn up, a contract of sorts outlining our arrangement. I'll have them for you to review tomorrow." "That seems sensible," Florence agreed, though the businesslike approach to their impending marriage felt strange. "Good night, then," Miles said, already turning to leave. "Good night, Mr. Vance." As she closed the door, Florence leaned against it, exhaling slowly. The man she was to marry in a week's time remained largely a mystery to her. Cold and businesslike on the surface, yet there were glimpses of something more: the pride in his voice when he spoke of building the ranch, the respectful way he treated his workers, the fact that he'd checked on her comfort before retiring. Florence climbed into bed, pulling the clean, fresh-smelling quilt up to her chin. Outside her window, the vast Texas night sky sparkled with more stars than she had ever seen in Boston. Despite the strangeness of her situation, she felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over her. For tonight at least, she was safe, fed, and had the promise of a future, however uncertain. Sleep claimed her quickly, her body surrendering to exhaustion after days of worry and fear. Her last conscious thought was a prayer that she had not made a terrible mistake. The following days passed in a blur of activity, as Florence struggled to learn the countless tasks required to run the ranch house. Each morning, she rose before dawn to help Mrs. Hattie prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. By the end of the first week, her soft hands had developed blisters, then calluses. Her back ached from hours spent bent over the washboard scrubbing clothes, and her arms burned from churning butter and kneading bread dough. Yet with each passing day, Florence found herself growing more capable. Mrs. Hattie proved a stern but patient teacher, guiding Florence through the mysteries of preserving, baking, cleaning, and the 100 other tasks that kept Starlight Ranch running smoothly. Miles remained distant, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark, consumed with ranch work. When they did share meals or brief conversations, he was unfailingly polite but reserved. Florence began to wonder if she would ever know the man she was to marry beyond these surface interactions. On the afternoon before Judge Parker's expected arrival, Florence was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard a commotion outside. Looking through the window, she saw several ranch hands rushing toward one of the corrals. Wiping her hands on her apron, Florence stepped onto the porch just as Mrs. Hattie came hurrying around the side of the house. "What's happening?" Florence asked. "New stallion broke loose," Mrs. Hattie replied breathlessly. "Wild as they come. Mr. Vance is trying to bring him in before he hurts himself or the other horses." Florence followed Mrs. Hattie's gaze to the largest corral, where a magnificent black stallion was rearing and bucking, sending ranch hands scrambling over fences to safety. Only Miles remained inside, moving with a calm, measured confidence that belied the danger. "Should someone help him?" Florence asked, alarmed by the stallion's ferocity. "Ain't nobody can handle that devil but Mr. Vance," Mrs. Hattie said with a mixture of pride and worry. "He's got away with the wildest horses. Always has." Florence watched, heart in her throat, as Miles spoke softly to the agitated stallion, gradually moving closer despite the animal's threatening posture. The ranch hands and several of the household staff had gathered to watch, their expressions reflecting the tension of the moment. For nearly half an hour, Miles worked patiently with the horse, never rushing, never showing fear. Gradually, the stallion's aggressive movements began to calm. When Miles finally reached out and placed a hand on the horse's quivering neck, a collective sigh of relief passed through the onlookers. Florence found herself staring at Miles with new eyes. The reserved, taciturn man she had come to know over the past week was transformed in the corral. Here, he moved with grace and showed a patience and gentleness she hadn't witnessed before. "That's why he's the boss," Jake said, appearing beside Florence. "Never seen a man with such a touch for horses." "It's remarkable," Florence agreed, unable to take her eyes off the scene. "Mr. Vance says a man who breaks a horse's spirit kills what made it special in the first place," Jake continued. "He believes in earning trust, not forcing submission." Something about those words resonated deeply with Florence. Wasn't that what she wanted too? Not to be broken by circumstances, but to find someone who valued her spirit even as she learned to adapt to a new life. When Miles finally led the now docile stallion to a separate pen and secured the gate, the gathered workers broke into spontaneous applause. He acknowledged them with a nod before noticing Florence watching from the porch. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Florence felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. That evening at supper, the taming of the black stallion was the main topic of conversation. Florence found herself watching Miles more closely than before, noticing the quiet authority he commanded without demanding it, the way the ranch hands respected rather than feared him. After the meal, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and Mrs. Hattie had retired for the night, Florence found herself alone with Miles on the front porch. The evening was pleasantly cool, a welcome relief after the heat of the day. "You were impressive with that horse today," Florence said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Miles looked surprised at the compliment. Thunder just needed someone to be patient with him. Most horses act out of fear, not malice. "Is that his name, Thunder?" Miles nodded. "Seemed fitting given how he announces himself." Florence smiled. "He's beautiful, all power and pride." "And intelligence," Miles added. "That's what makes him special. He thinks before he acts, evaluates situations. Most horses just react." They lapsed into silence again, but it felt less strained than their previous interactions. Florence gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Mr. Vance, Miles," she corrected herself. "Why have you never married before now? Surely there must have been opportunities." He seemed taken aback by her directness, but considered the question seriously. "Starlight has always come first," he said finally. "Building something that would last, that would matter. Women in these parts want town life, socials, neighbors. Can't blame them for that. And you never found someone willing to choose this life." Miles's gaze drifted to the darkening horizon. "Once. She said she loved the land as much as I did. Turned out she loved the idea of being a wealthy rancher's wife more." His jaw tightened slightly. "She left after 6 months, said the isolation was driving her mad." "I'm sorry," Florence said softly. He shrugged, the movement barely perceptible in the gathering dusk. "It was years ago. Taught me to be more practical about such things." "Hence our arrangement," Florence concluded. "Hence our arrangement," he agreed. "No false expectations, no disappointments." Florence nodded, understanding better now his businesslike approach to their impending marriage. He'd been hurt before, had learned to protect himself by keeping emotions out of the equation. "For what it's worth," she said carefully, "I find the land quite beautiful. Different from anything I've known, but beautiful in its own right." Miles studied her face as if searching for insincerity but found none. "Most Easterners think it's barren, empty." "Not empty," Florence disagreed. "Just vast, full of possibilities." She gestured toward the star-filled sky spreading endlessly above them. "I've never seen stars like these. In Boston, the city lights and smoke dim them considerably." Miles followed her gaze upward. That was the first thing I noticed as a boy, how the stars seem close enough to touch out here. Like you could reach up and pluck one if you tried hard enough. For the first time since they'd met, Florence saw a genuine smile transform Miles's face, softening the hard lines and revealing a dimple in his right cheek. The sight caused an unexpected warmth to bloom in her chest. "Judge Parker will be here tomorrow," Miles said, his expression growing serious again. "If you've changed your mind about our arrangement, now would be the time to say so." Florence considered the question honestly. The past week had been exhausting, filled with more physical labor than she had ever known. But it had also given her a purpose, a place to belong, and the beginnings of self-reliance she had never experienced in her sheltered Boston upbringing. "I haven't changed my mind," she said firmly. "Have you?" Miles shook his head. "No, I think this can work if we're both clear about what we expect." "I expect to work hard and make a contribution," Florence said, "and to have shelter and security in return. Then we understand each other." Miles rose from his chair. "We should both get some rest. Tomorrow will be a significant day." As Florence lay in bed that night, sleep proved elusive despite her physical exhaustion. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Miles Vance, taking vows before God and witnesses that traditionally spoke of love and devotion. Yet their marriage would be based on practicality rather than affection. Still, something had shifted this evening. She had glimpsed another side of Miles, the patient horse tamer, the boy who had marveled at the stars. Perhaps there was more to him than the stern, reserved rancher he presented to the world. Florence turned on her side, watching moonlight spill across the wooden floor of her room. Tomorrow she would marry a virtual stranger. Yet somehow the prospect seemed less daunting than it had a week ago. Miles Vance was a fair man, a hard worker, and he had offered her the one thing she needed most desperately: a home. For now, that would have to be enough. Judge Parker arrived shortly after noon the following day, a stocky man with a bristling mustache and keen eyes that missed nothing. He greeted Miles warmly, having known him for many years, then turned his assessing gaze on Florence. "So you're the bride," he said, not unkindly. "Miles tells me you're from Boston." "Yes, Your Honor," Florence replied, suddenly nervous. "My parents passed away recently, and circumstances brought me west." Judge Parker nodded, though his expression suggested he understood there was more to the story. "Well, Miss Sullivan, marriage is not something I take lightly. Before we proceed, I'd like a private word with you. To ensure this union is entered into willingly on both sides." Florence followed the judge into Miles's study, a book-lined room that had quickly become her favorite place in the house during her brief time at Starlight. Judge Parker closed the door and turned to face her. "Now then, Miss Sullivan, speak freely. Is this marriage your choice? Has there been any coercion?" "None whatsoever, Your Honor," Florence assured him. "Mr. Vance has been a gentleman throughout. Our arrangement is unconventional, I grant you, but it suits both our needs." The judge's bushy eyebrows rose. "And what needs would those be?" Florence hesitated, unwilling to admit the depths of her desperation upon meeting Miles. "I needed a fresh start. Mr. Vance needed someone to manage his household." Judge Parker studied her intently. "And there's nothing more I should know. No reason this marriage might be invalid or entered into under false pretenses." "No, Your Honor." Florence met his gaze steadily. "I may not have known Mr. Vance long, but I respect him and am committed to making our arrangement work." Something in her tone must have convinced him, for the judge nodded. "Very well. Miles Vance is one of the finest men I know. I wish you both happiness, however your marriage came to be." The ceremony itself was brief but dignified, held in the ranch house parlor with Mrs. Hattie, Jake, Tom, and several other ranch employees as witnesses. Florence wore her best dress, her only good one, really a blue cotton that Mrs. Hattie had helped freshen with a pressed collar and cuffs. Miles was clean-shaven and wearing a dark suit that transformed him from rugged rancher to distinguished gentleman. As they exchanged vows, Florence was struck by the solemnity in Miles's voice. Whatever his reasons for entering this marriage of convenience, he clearly took the commitment seriously. When it came time to place the ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, he'd explained earlier his calloused fingers were unexpectedly gentle against her skin. "By the authority vested in me by the state of Texas, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Parker declared. "You may kiss your bride, Miles." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Miles's face, and Florence realized he hadn't considered this traditional aspect of the ceremony. For a moment, she thought he might decline, but then he leaned forward and pressed his lips briefly, chastely to hers. It was over in an instant, yet Florence felt an unexpected jolt of awareness at the contact. Miles's eyes met hers as he pulled away, and she thought she glimpsed similar surprise in their blue depths before his expression shuddered once more. The small gathering offered congratulations, and Mrs. Hattie produced a modest wedding dinner with a cake she had secretly baked the day before. Judge Parker regaled them with stories from his circuit, bringing welcome levity to what might otherwise have been an awkward occasion. By the time the judge departed, promising to file the marriage certificate promptly in the county seat, the sun was setting over the western hills. The ranch hands returned to their evening chores, and Mrs. Hattie tactfully retired early, leaving the newlyweds alone. Florence stood in the parlor, suddenly unsure of herself. The practical nature of their arrangement hadn't prepared her for the reality of being Miles Vance's wife, of sharing his home not as a guest but as its mistress. Miles seemed equally uncertain. He cleared his throat. "I've had my things moved to the bedroom down the hall from yours, I thought. That is, given the nature of our arrangement." "Yes, of course," Florence agreed quickly, relieved and yet oddly disappointed. "That makes perfect sense." Another awkward silence fell between them. "Would you like to sit on the porch for a while?" Miles offered finally. "The evening's pleasant." Florence nodded gratefully, and they moved outside to the chairs they had occupied the previous evening. The familiar routine eased some of the tension between them. "So," Miles said after they had sat in silence for several minutes, "how does it feel to be Mrs. Vance?" Florence considered the question. "Strange," she admitted, "though perhaps no stranger than how these past 2 weeks have unfolded overall." A hint of a smile touched Miles's lips. "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. Indeed it does." Florence glanced at the gold band now adorning her left hand. "I want to thank you again, Miles. Not many men would have offered such an arrangement to a desperate stranger." "Not many women would have had the courage to propose it," he countered. "Or to throw themselves into ranch life with such determination." The compliment warmed Florence. "Mrs. Hattie has been an excellent teacher, though I fear my bread still leaves something to be desired." "It's improved considerably since your first attempt," Miles said, his eyes crinkling with suppressed amusement. "Jake was using those early biscuits to break in new boots." Florence gasped in mock offense. "He was not." "No, but only because they were too hard even for that." To her surprise, Florence found herself laughing, and after a moment, Miles joined her. The sound of his laughter, rich and genuine, transformed his face completely, and Florence found herself wishing she could hear it more often. When their mirth subsided, a more comfortable silence settled between them. The vast Texas sky darkened above them, stars appearing one by one until the heavens were ablaze with light. "I've been thinking," Miles said eventually, "that you might enjoy having a garden." The previous owners had one on the south side of the house. It's overgrown now, but the soil is good. Florence brightened at the suggestion. I would love that. My mother kept a small garden in Boston, nothing elaborate, but I helped her tend it and found it soothing. Consider it yours, then. Jake can help you clear it whenever you're ready. Thank you. Florence hesitated, then added, I'd like to contribute more than just keeping house. I was thinking, perhaps I could help with the ranch accounts. I've some skill with figures and was taught proper bookkeeping by my father. Miles looked surprised but not displeased by the offer. Tom handles most of the books now, but he's complained about the workload. I'll speak with him about sharing some of those duties with you. Florence smiled, pleased he hadn't dismissed the suggestion outright. It was a small thing, but it made her feel their arrangement might evolve into a genuine partnership rather than merely an exchange of services. As they continued to talk, the tension that had marked their earlier interactions gradually dissipated. Miles spoke of his plans for breeding stronger cattle by introducing new bloodlines from back east. Florence shared stories of her life in Boston, carefully edited to focus on happier times rather than the financial ruin that had ultimately driven her west. By the time they retired for the night, Florence felt more at ease with her new husband than she had since their first meeting. They might not have a conventional marriage, but perhaps they could build something meaningful nonetheless. At her bedroom door, Miles paused. Good night, Florence. And welcome to Starlight, truly. Good night, Miles, she replied softly. Thank you for giving me a home. He nodded once, then continued down the hall to his own room. Florence closed her door and leaned against it, acknowledging the curious mixture of emotions swirling within her. Relief, gratitude, uncertainty, and beneath it all, a flicker of something she wasn't ready to name. Whatever the future held for this unusual marriage, Florence was determined to make the best of it. She had a roof over her head and, for the first time in months, hope for what tomorrow might bring. The weeks following the wedding brought significant changes to Florence's life at Starlight Ranch. With Mrs. Hattie's continued guidance, she gradually mastered the domestic skills required to run the busy household. Her bread no longer resembled building materials. Her stews were flavorful rather than bland, and she had even learned to make pies that earned genuine praise from the ranch hands. True to his word, Miles had spoken with Tom about sharing the bookkeeping duties. Florence now spent several hours each week working in the ranch office, meticulously recording expenses and income, organizing receipts, and helping prepare orders for supplies. The work gave her immense satisfaction, allowing her to apply her education in ways she hadn't expected when agreeing to become a rancher's wife. The garden, too, had become a source of joy. With Jake's help, she had cleared the overgrown plot and planted vegetables and herbs that would supplement the ranch's food stores. She had even added a small section of flowers, marigolds, sunflowers, and wild roses to bring color to the otherwise practical space. Her relationship with Miles evolved slowly but steadily. Their evening conversations on the porch became a regular ritual, a time when they could discuss the day's events and share thoughts without the distractions of ranch work or household duties. Florence came to treasure these quiet moments, looking forward to them throughout her busy days. Though they maintained separate bedrooms as agreed, Florence found herself growing increasingly aware of Miles as a man rather than merely her practical benefactor. She noticed the way sunlight caught in his hair, the graceful strength with which he moved, the rare but transformative effect of his smile. These observations confused and sometimes alarmed her. Their arrangement had never been meant to include such feelings. For his part, Miles remained somewhat reserved, though Florence sensed his barriers gradually lowering. He sought her opinion on ranch matters more frequently, listened attentively to her suggestions, and occasionally shared stories from his past that revealed the boy he had been before responsibility had shaped him into the man he became. Mrs. Hattie observed these developments with knowing eyes, but kept her thoughts largely to herself. As September drew to a close, marking the end of her agreed-upon time at Starlight, she finally spoke her mind while helping Florence prepare breakfast one morning. "You two are dancing around each other like skittish colts," the older woman remarked bluntly, cutting biscuit dough with practiced efficiency. Florence nearly dropped the coffee pot. "I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Hattie snorted. "Course you do. You watch him when you think nobody's looking. And he does the same with you. Our arrangement is practical, Mrs. Hattie. We've both been clear about that from the beginning. Arrangements have a way of changing when hearts get involved," Mrs. Hattie said sagely. "Ain't nothing wrong with that. Might be the best thing that could happen for both of you." Florence busied herself with setting the table, unwilling to acknowledge the truth in the housekeeper's words. "Miles married me to have someone manage his household, nothing more. And you married him for a roof overhead," Mrs. Hattie agreed. "But life has a way of giving us more than we bargained for if we're open to receiving it." Before Florence could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Miles entered, bringing with him the crisp scent of the October morning. He nodded to both women, his gaze lingering briefly on Florence. "Morning," he greeted them. "Smells good in here." "Just in time," Mrs. Hattie said cheerfully. "Florence made the biscuits today and they're her best yet." Miles smiled approvingly at Florence. "You've come a long way from those first attempts." "Practice and proper instruction," Florence replied, returning his smile while trying to ignore the warmth his approval kindled in her chest. "Mrs. Hattie has been an excellent teacher. And now my teaching days are done, Mrs. Hattie declared, wiping her hands on her apron. "My daughter's expecting me by week's end, and Florence here is more than capable of running things without me." A shadow crossed Miles's face. "You'll be missed, Mrs. Hattie. Starlight won't be the same without you." "Nonsense," the older woman scoffed, though her eyes betrayed her fondness for the ranch and its owner. "You've got yourself a fine wife now. Time for this old woman to go spoil her grandbabies." The day of Mrs. Hattie's departure arrived with unexpected swiftness. Florence found herself fighting tears as she helped the housekeeper pack her remaining belongings into the wagon that would take her to town, where she would catch the stagecoach to Dallas. "Now, don't you go getting all weepy on me, Mrs. Hattie chided, though her own eyes were suspiciously bright. "I've left all my recipes written down clear as day, and you know where everything is." "It's not the recipes I'll miss," Florence said softly. "It's you." Mrs. Hattie's weathered face softened. "You'll do fine, child. Better than fine." She lowered her voice, glancing toward where Miles was loading her trunk onto the wagon. "He's a good man who's been alone too long, and you're a good woman who deserves more than a roof overhead." Before Florence could respond, Mrs. Hattie pressed a small package into her hands. "My wedding gift to you both. Open it after I'm gone." Minutes later, the wagon pulled away, Mrs. Hattie waving from the seat beside Jake, who would drive her to town. Florence watched until it disappeared over the rise, then turned back to the house that now felt strangely empty despite being unchanged. Miles stood on the porch, his expression pensive. "It'll be quiet without her." "Yes," Florence agreed, climbing the steps to join him. "Though perhaps our ears will finally stop ringing from her constant instructions." That earned a small smile from Miles. "What's that?" he asked, noticing the package in her hands. "A wedding gift, apparently. She said to open it after she left." They moved into the parlor, where Florence carefully unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a hand-stitched quilt of astonishing beauty. Intricate patterns in shades of blue, green, and golden yellow formed a star motif that seemed to capture the essence of the Texas night sky. "It's beautiful," Florence breathed, running her fingers over the precise stitching. Miles looked equally impressed. "She must have been working on this for months without either of us noticing." A small note fell from the folds of the quilt. Florence picked it up and read aloud. "For Miles and Florence, may this warm your marriage bed and remind you that the stars shine brightest when shared with someone you love." Hattie Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks at the implication, and a quick glance showed Miles looking equally discomfited. "Mrs. Hattie always did speak her mind," he said finally, his voice slightly rough. "Indeed she did." Florence carefully refolded the quilt, uncertain what to do with it given their sleeping arrangements. "It's a thoughtful gift, regardless." Miles nodded, then seemed to make a decision. "I have some news that might interest you. Judge Parker will be passing through next week with a wagon of books for the new schoolhouse in Wasco. He mentioned he has several crates of novels and such that were donated by some Eastern Ladies Society. Thought you might like first pick before they are distributed." Florence's face lit up at the prospect. She had read her copy of Pride and Prejudice so many times since arriving at Starlight that the binding was beginning to fail. "That would be wonderful. Thank you for thinking of me." "I know you miss your books," Miles said simply. "Noticed how you've been eyeing the few volumes in my study, though most are practical texts on ranching and animal husbandry." The fact that he had noticed such a detail touched Florence deeply. It suggested he paid more attention to her preferences and happiness than she had realized. That evening, after completing the day's chores, Florence found herself alone in the large house for the first time since her arrival at Starlight. Miles had ridden out with several hands to check on a section of fence reported damaged by a recent storm, leaving her to prepare and eat supper by herself. The silence was both liberating and oppressive. Florence moved through the familiar rooms, touching furniture and objects that had become part of her daily life. With Mrs. Hattie gone, she was truly the mistress of Starlight, now responsible for its smooth operation and the comfort of those who lived and worked there. She found herself in Miles's study, drawn to the bookshelves that lined one wall. Running her fingers along the leather spines, she selected a volume on the natural history of Texas and settled into the comfortable chair behind the desk. The book proved surprisingly engaging, detailing the diverse landscapes and wildlife of her adopted home state. Florence was particularly captivated by the descriptions of wildflowers that carpeted the hills in spring, a spectacle she had not yet witnessed, having arrived in the heat of summer. She was so absorbed in reading that she didn't hear Miles return until the study door opened, startling her from her concentration. "I'm sorry," she said, rising hastily. "I should have asked before using your study." Miles shook his head, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "No need to apologize. What's mine is yours now, remember. That's how marriage works, even one like ours." Florence resumed her seat as Miles poured himself a small glass of whiskey from a decanter on the sideboard. He looked tired, with dust from the trail still clinging to his clothes. "Would you like some supper?" she offered. "I can warm it up for you." "That would be welcome, thank you." In the kitchen, Florence busied herself reheating the stew she had prepared earlier. Miles followed, leaning against the doorframe as he sipped his whiskey. "Found anything interesting in that book?" he asked. Florence nodded. "I had no idea Texas had such diverse wildflowers. The descriptions sound magnificent." "They are," Miles confirmed. "Come spring, the hills around Starlight turn blue with bluebonnets. Reminds me why I love this land, even when it's being stubborn and difficult." Florence smiled at the comparison. Like taming thunder, something like that. Miles finished his whiskey and set the glass aside. The fence damage was worse than reported. I'll need to ride out again tomorrow with more men and materials. Will you be gone overnight? Florence asked, trying to keep her tone casual despite the unexpected pang the thought provoked. Miles hesitated. Probably. It's a good 15 miles to that section of the property, and the work will take most of a day. Florence nodded, serving the reheated stew into a bowl and placing it on the table along with fresh bread. I'll pack provisions for you and the men. Miles sat down to eat, and Florence found herself watching him covertly, noting the strong line of his jaw, the capable hands that could gentle wild horses yet build fences with equal skill. When had she begun to see him this way? To notice him not just as her practical benefactor, but as a man she found increasingly compelling. Mrs. Hattie's words echoed in her mind. Arrangements have a way of changing when hearts get involved. Was that what was happening? Was her heart becoming involved despite her determination to maintain the practical nature of their arrangement? You're quiet tonight, Miles observed, interrupting her thoughts. Florence shrugged slightly. Just thinking about all the changes these past months have brought. When I stepped off that stagecoach in Wasco, I never imagined I'd end up here. Do you regret it? Miles asked, his voice carefully neutral. No, Florence answered honestly. Starlight has become home in a way I didn't expect. I'm grateful for the chance you gave me. Miles studied her face for a long moment. And our arrangement, do you find it satisfactory? The question seemed to hold more weight than its simple wording suggested. Florence considered her response carefully. It served its purpose, she said finally. We both got what we needed. Yes, Miles agreed, though something in his tone suggested he might be thinking beyond their initial agreement. We did. An unexpectedly charged silence fell between them. Florence busied herself with tidying the kitchen, aware of Miles watching her movements. When she finished, she turned to find him still seated at the table, his expression thoughtful. Florence, he began, then seemed to reconsider. Never mind. It's late and we both have early starts tomorrow. What is it? She prompted gently. Miles shook his head. Nothing that can't wait. Good night, Florence. Good night, Miles. As she prepared for bed later, Florence found herself dwelling on that unfinished conversation, wondering what Miles had been about to say. Their relationship had evolved considerably since their hasty wedding, but the fundamental nature of their arrangement remained unchanged. Or did it? Florence lay awake long after she should have been sleeping, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house without Mrs. Hattie's reassuring presence down the hall. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were a confusing mixture of blooming wildflowers and Miles's face as he'd looked at her across the kitchen table, as if seeing her truly seeing her for the first time. Morning came too quickly, gray dawn light filtering through her curtains as Florence rose to prepare breakfast and pack provisions for Miles and the ranch hands who would accompany him to repair the fence. By the time the men gathered in the kitchen, she had hot coffee, eggs, bacon, and biscuits waiting, along with packed lunches for their saddlebags. Appreciate this, Mrs. Vance, Jake said, tipping his hat as he accepted the packed lunch. Your cooking's gotten right tasty since those first attempts. Florence smiled, accepting the good-natured teasing with grace. Just be thankful I'm not sending those early biscuits for you to use as ammunition against any rattlesnakes you encounter. The men laughed, and Florence caught Miles watching her with a hint of pride in his expression. The simple moment of camaraderie felt significant somehow, as if she had finally found her place within the ranch's complex social structure. As the men prepared to depart, Miles drew Florence aside briefly. We'll be back by tomorrow evening at the latest. If you need anything, Tom is staying behind to mind things here." "We'll manage fine," Florence assured him. "Be careful out there." Miles hesitated, then reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. "I'll be back before you know it." The small gesture, their first real physical contact since their wedding day, left Florence with a curious fluttering sensation in her chest as she watched Miles and the others ride away from the ranch. She stood on the porch until they disappeared from view, then turned back to the house with a sigh. There was plenty of work to keep her occupied during their absence. The day passed quickly enough with routine chores and meal preparation for the remaining hands. Florence also spent time in her garden, harvesting late vegetables and preparing the soil for winter. By evening, however, the unusual quiet of the house began to weigh on her. After supper, Florence found herself once again in Miles's study, drawn to the comfort of books and the lingering scent of leather and tobacco that reminded her of him. She selected a different volume this time, a collection of poetry she discovered tucked between ranching manuals, as if hidden away. Opening it, she was surprised to find handwritten notes in the margins, observations and underlined passages that revealed a side of Miles she had not glimpsed before. He had marked Tennyson's Ulysses extensively, particularly the lines about striving, seeking, finding, and not yielding. Another heavily annotated poem was Browning's Love Among the Ruins, where Miles had underlined, "When I do come, she will speak not, she will stand either hand on my shoulder, give her eyes the first embrace of my face, ere we rush, ere we extinguish sight and speech each on each." Florence traced the neat handwriting with her fingertip, feeling as if she had discovered a secret window into Miles's soul. This practical, hard-working rancher harbored an appreciation for poetry that spoke of deep emotions and noble aspirations, things he kept carefully hidden behind his reserved exterior. She was still pondering this discovery when a sudden crash of thunder made her jump. Rain began to lash against the windows, driven by a powerful wind that had sprung up seemingly from nowhere. Florence moved through the house, securing shutters and ensuring all was battened down against the unexpected storm. As the night wore on, the storm intensified. Florence found herself worrying about Miles and the others, caught out on the range in such weather. She tried to reassure herself that they were experienced men who would find shelter, but anxiety lingered nonetheless. Unable to sleep, she sat by her window watching lightning split the Texas sky, illuminating the ranch buildings in brief, stark flashes. The storm's raw power was both terrifying and magnificent, a reminder of how small human concerns could be against nature's might. Sometime near dawn, Florence must have dozed off in the chair, for she woke with a start to find pale sunlight streaming through her window. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles and scattered branches, but no serious damage that she could see from her vantage point. After dressing quickly, Florence made her way downstairs to find Tom already in the kitchen, brewing coffee. "Morning, Mrs. Vance," he greeted her. "Some storm, wasn't it?" "Indeed," Florence agreed, moving to help with breakfast preparations. "I hope Miles and the others found shelter." Tom nodded. "Boss knows this land better than anyone. They'll have holed up somewhere dry." Despite his reassurance, Florence couldn't shake her concern. She went about her daily tasks with half her attention on the horizon, watching for returning riders. By mid-afternoon, with no sign of Miles and his men, Florence's worry had deepened considerably. She was in the garden harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes when the sound of approaching horses made her look up expectantly. It wasn't Miles, however, but Jake and two other hands, all looking trail-weary and concerned. "Mrs. Vance," Jake called as he dismounted. Boss sent us ahead to let you know he's coming along slower. Florence hurried toward him, alarm rising at his grave expression. Is something wrong? Is Miles hurt? Jake removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. He took a bad fall when his horse spooked during the storm, got his leg trapped under it for a spell before we could get to him. Florence's hand flew to her mouth. How badly is he injured? Can't rightly say. He wouldn't let us examine it properly, just insisted on riding back himself, though slower. Should be here within the hour. Jake's expression conveyed his concern more eloquently than words. He's in considerable pain, madam, though he won't admit it. Florence's mind raced. Tom, she called to the ranch manager who had joined them, ride for the doctor in Wasco. Tell him to come as quickly as possible. As Tom mounted up and rode out, Florence turned back to Jake. Help me prepare a room downstairs. Miles won't be able to manage the stairs with an injured leg. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity, as Florence directed the conversion of Miles's study into a temporary sick room. She had Jake move in a bed from one of the spare rooms, then gathered clean linens, bandages, and the medicinal supplies kept on hand for emergencies. When Hoofbeats finally announced Miles's arrival, Florence rushed onto the porch, her heart clenching at the sight that greeted her. Miles sat slumped in his saddle, his face gray with pain beneath several days' growth of beard. Two ranch hands rode close beside him, clearly ready to catch him should he fall. Miles, Florence called, hurrying down the steps as they helped him dismount. The moment his right foot touched the ground, he let out a barely suppressed groan, his weight collapsing against the men supporting him. I'm fine, he insisted through gritted teeth, though the claim was patently false. Just need to rest a bit. You need a doctor, Florence countered firmly, which is why Tom has ridden to fetch one. In the meantime, we've prepared a bed for you downstairs. Miles looked as if he might argue, but seemed to lack the strength. He allowed himself to be half carried into the house and settled on the bed in his converted study. Once horizontal, some of the tension left his face, though pain still etched deep lines around his mouth and eyes. Everyone out, Florence commanded once Miles was situated. I need to examine the injury. The ranch hands filed out, leaving Florence alone with her husband. She approached the bed, her expression brooking no argument. I need to see your leg, Miles. We have to know how bad it is before the doctor arrives. Miles nodded reluctantly. You'll need to cut the boot off. Don't think it'll come off otherwise. Florence found scissors and carefully cut away the leather boot, wincing at Miles's sharp intake of breath despite her gentle touch. When the boot and sock were removed, she surveyed the damage with growing concern. His lower leg was grotesquely swollen, the skin mottled with bruising from ankle to knee. Whether it was broken or merely badly sprained, Florence couldn't determine, but the injury was clearly serious. The horse rolled on it, Miles explained through clenched teeth. Got caught in a gully during the worst of the storm. Poor beast was as frightened as I've ever seen him. Is the horse all right? Florence asked, knowing Miles would be concerned despite his own injury. A faint smile touched his lips. He's fine. More worried about my dignity than any real damage. Florence soaked a cloth in cool water and placed it gently over the worst of the swelling. I've sent for the doctor. Until then, we need to keep the leg elevated and try to reduce the swelling. Miles nodded, his eyes closing briefly. Florence, he stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. Thank you for taking charge of things. That's what partners do, she replied softly, the word feeling right despite the unconventional nature of their marriage. Help each other when needed. His eyes opened, finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Partners, he repeated. Yes, I suppose we are. The arrival of the doctor interrupted whatever might have followed. Doctor. Abernathy, a gruff but competent physician who served the scattered ranches and farms around Wasco, examined Miles's leg with practiced efficiency. "Broken," he pronounced after gentle but thorough probing that left Miles white-lipped with pain. "Clean break of the tibia, fortunately. No compound fracture, which is a blessing. Still, you'll be off this leg for at least 6 weeks, Mr. Vance." Miles's expression darkened. 6 weeks? That's impossible. The ranch will still be here when you're healed, Dr. Abernathy interrupted firmly. "Push too soon and you could end up with a permanent limp or worse." Florence stepped forward. "We'll ensure he follows your instructions, doctor." The physician cast an appraising glance at Florence. "See that you do, Mrs. Vance. Your husband strikes me as the stubborn type." After setting the bone, a process that had Miles biting down on a folded leather belt to avoid crying out, and applying a plaster cast, Dr. Abernathy provided detailed instructions for Miles's care and promised to return in 2 weeks to check on his progress. "Complete rest for at least 10 days, he emphasized to Florence as he prepared to leave. "Then he can begin to move about on crutches, which I'll have sent out from town, but no weight on that leg for the full 6 weeks." Once the doctor had departed, Florence returned to find Miles struggling to sit up. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, hurrying to his side. "Need to speak with Tom about ranch operations," Miles grunted, his face pale with renewed pain. "Can't just lie here while work needs doing." Florence placed a firm hand on his shoulder, pressing him gently back against the pillows. "Tom can come to you. The doctor was quite clear about complete rest for the next 10 days. Miles looked as if he might argue, but instead sank back with a sigh of defeat. "Never been much good at lying still." "Then it's fortunate you have me to ensure you follow orders," Florence replied, adjusting his pillows. "The ranch won't fall apart in your absence, Miles. You've built something strong here with good men who know their jobs." Her words seemed to reassure him somewhat. "You're right, of course. It's just difficult to be helpless." "You're not helpless," Florence corrected gently. "You're healing. There's a difference." Later, after ensuring Miles had taken the laudanum prescribed for pain and fallen into a troubled sleep, Florence met with Tom and Jake to discuss ranch operations during their employer's convalescence. "We'll manage the day-to-day just fine," Tom assured her. "Boss has trained us well. Main concern is the cattle drive scheduled for next month. We're contracted to deliver 300 head to the railroad at Fort Worth." Florence frowned thoughtfully. "Miles won't be able to lead it himself. Who's next in line of experience?" "That'd be Jake," Tom said, nodding toward the foreman. "He's ridden point-on drives before when the boss couldn't go." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I can handle it, Mrs. Vance, but it's a big responsibility. Lot of money riding on those cattle reaching market in good condition." "Miles trusts you," Florence said simply. "As do I. The drive will proceed as planned with you in charge, Jake. I'll speak with Miles about it once he's more comfortable, but I'm certain he'll agree." The two men exchanged glances, clearly impressed by Florence's decisive handling of the situation. It struck her suddenly how far she had come from the desperate young woman who had arrived in Wasco just months ago, without prospects or confidence in her own abilities. That night, after checking on Miles one final time and ensuring he was resting as comfortably as possible, Florence retired to her room with a curious mixture of emotions. Concern for Miles's well-being warred with a newfound sense of capability and purpose. The ranch hands had looked to her for leadership in Miles's incapacity, and she had risen to the challenge. More confusing were her personal feelings toward Miles himself. Seeing him injured had awakened a protectiveness she hadn't known she possessed. The thought of him in pain distressed her far more than made sense for a marriage based solely on practical considerations. Florence sat at her dressing table, absently brushing her hair as she contemplated these developments. The woman reflected in the mirror looked different from the frightened, desperate girl who had proposed marriage to a stranger. Her face had grown subtly stronger, her eyes more confident, her skin lightly tanned from work in the garden. Texas had changed her, as had Starlight Ranch. As had Miles Vance, with his quiet strength and unexpected depths. Florence set down her brush, acknowledging the truth she had been avoiding for weeks now. Somewhere along the way, her feelings for Miles had transformed from gratitude and respect into something far more complicated and dangerous to their carefully constructed arrangement. She had fallen in love with her husband. The realization should have terrified her, yet Florence felt an odd sense of calm as she named the emotion that had been growing within her. Love explained the flutter in her chest when Miles smiled, the comfort she found in their evening conversations, the emptiness she'd felt during his absence. What it didn't explain was what she should do about these feelings. Their marriage had been predicated on the explicit understanding that romance wasn't part of the bargain. Miles had been hurt before by a woman who claimed to love him but couldn't adapt to ranch life. Why would he risk his heart again, especially with someone who had married him out of desperation rather than desire? Florence extinguished her lamp and climbed into bed, drawing the quilt around her shoulders. Mrs. Hattie's wedding gift remained carefully stored in her armoire, a symbol of possibilities neither she nor Miles had contemplated when speaking their vows. As sleep gradually claimed her, Florence resolved to keep her newfound feelings private. Miles needed her practical support now more than ever. Complicating their relationship with unrequited emotions would serve neither of them well. Morning brought a new routine to Starlight Ranch. Florence rose early as always, but now divided her time between regular household duties and caring for Miles, who proved to be a frustratingly difficult patient. Accustomed to constant activity, he chafed against the enforced idleness of recovery. "I'm perfectly capable of reviewing the accounts from this bed," he insisted when Florence brought him breakfast on the third day of his convalescence. "And I need to discuss the cattle drive with Jake." "After you eat," Florence countered firmly, placing the tray across his lap. Doctor's orders were clear: rest first, ranch business second. Miles scowled but applied himself to the eggs and bacon she had prepared. "You sound like my mother." "I'll take that as a compliment," Florence replied serenely. She obviously raised a son who recognizes when he's outmatched. To her delight, Miles's scowl dissolved into reluctant laughter. "Touché, Mrs. Vance." He gestured to the chair beside his bed. "At least sit with me while I eat. Tell me how things are progressing outside these four walls." Florence sat, smoothing her skirts. "The ranch is running smoothly. Tom has everything well in hand, and Jake is preparing for the cattle drive. I've spoken with both about proceeding as planned, with Jake leading in your stead." Miles looked surprised. "You've already addressed the cattle drive." "It seemed the logical course of action," Florence replied, suddenly uncertain. "Was I overstepping?" "No," Miles said quickly. "You made exactly the decision I would have. I'm just impressed by how quickly you've taken charge." Florence relaxed slightly. "I may have married you for a roof overhead, Miles Vance, but I've never been one to sit idle when work needs doing." Something flickered in Miles's eyes at her words, an expression Florence couldn't quite interpret. "No, you certainly haven't," he agreed softly. "Starlight is fortunate to have you." The simple compliment warmed Florence more than it should have. "Well," she said, rising to hide her flustered reaction, "finish your breakfast and I'll fetch the account books for you to review, but only for an hour. Then rest." As she turned to leave, Miles caught her hand. The unexpected contact sent a jolt through Florence's entire body. "Florence," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I thank you for everything." She squeezed his hand gently before withdrawing her own. "Partners, remember, that's what we agreed." Over the following days, a new intimacy developed between them, born of Miles's dependency and Florence's caregiving role. Physical boundaries that had been carefully maintained since their wedding necessarily relaxed, as Florence helped Miles change positions, brought him meals, and even assisted with personal grooming when his beard grew too uncomfortable in the Texas heat. These small domestic interactions, mundane in a normal marriage, took on heightened significance in their arrangement. Each touch, each moment of vulnerability shared between them, seemed to chip away at the artificial constraints they had placed on their relationship. Florence found herself looking forward to the quiet evening hours when ranch work was done, and she could sit beside Miles, reading aloud from one of his books or simply talking about the day's events. Sometimes they played chess on a small board set up beside his bed, Florence delighting in the rare occasions when she managed to outmaneuver her strategically minded husband. For his part, Miles seemed to undergo a subtle transformation during his convalescence. Forced inactivity gave him time for reflection, and Florence often caught him watching her with a thoughtful expression she couldn't quite decipher. He spoke more freely of his past, sharing stories of his childhood and the early, difficult years of building Starlight into a successful operation. One evening, about 2 weeks into his recovery, Miles mentioned the poetry book Florence had discovered in his study the night of the storm. "I saw you'd moved my Tennyson," he remarked casually, as Florence arranged fresh flowers on the table beside his bed. "Did you have a chance to read any of it?" Florence paused, a bloom of crimson creeping up her neck. "I hope you don't mind. I found it the night of the storm and was surprised to discover your annotations." Miles looked slightly embarrassed. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She believed a properly educated man should appreciate literature as well as practical knowledge." He shrugged. "The habit of making notes stuck with me." "I found your observations insightful," Florence said honestly. "Particularly those on love among the ruins." Miles's gaze sharpened. "Did you now?" Something in his tone made Florence's pulse quicken. "Yes, it's a beautiful poem." The contrast between past glory and present simplicity, yet finding that love makes the simple present more valuable than the grand past. "That was always my interpretation as well," Miles said softly. "Though I've sometimes wondered if Browning wasn't being overly optimistic about love's power to overcome life's disappointments." The conversation had taken an unexpectedly personal turn. Florence busied herself rearranging the flowers to hide her discomfort. "I suppose that depends on the love in question, and the people involved." Miles seemed about to pursue the topic further when a knock at the door heralded the arrival of Dr. Abernathy, returned as promised to check on his patient's progress. Florence excused herself, grateful for the interruption that had prevented her from revealing too much of her growing feelings. The doctor's assessment was positive. Miles's leg was healing well, and he could now begin limited movement with the aid of crutches, which the doctor had brought with him. "Still no weight on that leg," Dr. Abernathy warned sternly. "But you can move about the house a bit each day. Good for circulation and preventing stiffness in the rest of your body." Once the doctor had departed, Miles was eager to test his new mobility. Florence helped him sit on the edge of the bed, then positioned the crutches under his arms. "Slowly," she cautioned as he pushed himself upright, balancing awkwardly on his good leg. "There's no rush." Miles winced as he adjusted to the crutches but managed a triumphant smile once he was standing. "Freedom at last," Limited freedom, Florence reminded him, and only with supervision until you're steadier. Miles took a tentative swing forward on the crutches, his movements clumsy but determined. Where to first? I've been staring at these four walls for 2 weeks. How about the front porch? The weather's pleasant and you can see the ranch from there. Miles nodded, and they began the slow journey from the study to the front door. By the time they reached the porch, he was breathing heavily from exertion, though he tried to hide it. Here, Florence said, guiding him to one of the rocking chairs. Sit before you fall. Miles sank gratefully onto the chair, extending his casted leg carefully before him. I'd forgotten how much effort simple movement takes. Florence settled into the adjacent chair, watching as Miles's gaze swept hungrily over the ranch spread out before them. The afternoon sun bathed the buildings and pastures in golden light, cattle grazing peacefully in the distance while ranch hands moved about their daily tasks. It's been running smoothly without me, Miles observed, his tone a mixture of pride and something like surprise. Because you built it to be strong, Florence said. Good men, good systems, but don't think for a moment they haven't missed your guidance. Tom consults your instructions daily, and Jake's been in twice a day for advice about the cattle drive. Miles nodded, seeming pleased by this information. And you? Have you missed having the house to yourself now that I'm mobile enough to invade your domain? The teasing question caught Florence off guard. I've rather enjoyed having company, actually, she admitted. The house feels too quiet when you're not in it. The words emerged more revealing than she had intended. Miles turned to look at her, his expression suddenly intent. Florence, Mr. Vance. The call from the yard interrupted whatever Miles had been about to say. One of the younger ranch hands was riding toward the house at a gallop, his expression urgent. What is it, Charlie? Miles called, straightening in his chair. Rustlers, sir. Tom sent me to warn you. They hit the north section last night, took about 30 head by our count. Miles cursed under his breath, already reaching for his crutches. Any of our men hurt? No, sir, but Tom says they left clear tracks heading west toward the Davis place. That abandoned homestead has been a hideout for troublemakers before, Miles muttered, struggling to rise. Florence, help me back inside. I need to meet with Tom and Jake immediately. The peaceful moment shattered. Florence assisted Miles back to the house, where he sent Charlie to summon the ranch's leadership. Within half an hour, Tom, Jake, and several senior hands had gathered in Miles's temporary quarters to discuss the rustling incident. I want those cattle back, Miles declared firmly, and I want the men responsible facing justice. We can track them easy enough, Jake said, but they're likely armed and desperate if they're holed up at the Davis place. Take 6 men, Miles instructed. Well armed. If it's who I think it is, that Rollins gang from down San Antonio way, they're dangerous but not stupid. Show enough force, and they might surrender without bloodshed. Florence listened to the discussion with growing concern. Shouldn't we notify the sheriff in Wasco? The men exchanged glances, and Tom cleared his throat. Sheriff Hayes is not particularly effective against organized rustlers, madam. By the time he organized a posse and reached the Davis place, those cattle would be long gone. Then at least wait until morning, Florence urged, looking at Miles. Tracking in darkness is dangerous, and the men will be better prepared after a night's rest. Miles considered this, then nodded. Florence is right. First light tomorrow, Jake. Select your men, prepare provisions, and be ready to move out at dawn. The decision made, the men dispersed to make preparations, leaving Florence alone with Miles once more. She could see the frustration written plainly on his face, the rancher forced to send others to defend his property while he remained behind. I should be leading them, he said, confirming her observation. It's my responsibility. You trained good men for exactly this kind of situation, Florence reminded him gently. Trust them to handle it. Miles sighed heavily. I do trust them. It's just he broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. A man should defend what's his. You are, Florence said firmly. By making wise decisions from here. Leadership isn't always about being first into battle, Miles. Sometimes it's about knowing when to delegate. He looked at her with grudging appreciation. When did you get so wise about ranching, Boston girl? I've had an excellent teacher these past months, Florence replied with a small smile. A stubborn one, but excellent nonetheless. Miles chuckled, his dark mood lightening somewhat. I suppose I have been a difficult patient. Impossible, Florence corrected, but her tone was affectionate. Though I've managed to survive the ordeal thus far. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of how their relationship had evolved beyond its practical beginnings. Miles looked as if he might say something significant, but then shook his head slightly. You should rest, Florence said, breaking the charged silence. Tomorrow will be tense until we hear from Jake, and you'll need your strength to avoid doing something foolish like trying to mount a horse with that cast. Miles's expression turned innocent. The thought never crossed my mind. Liar, Florence accused without heat. I know you too well by now, Miles Vance. As she helped him prepare for sleep, Florence wondered if that was true. Did she really know this complex man who had become her husband? Or was she only beginning to discover the layers beneath his reserved exterior? The following day crawled by with excruciating slowness as they awaited news from Jake and his men. Miles was terrible company, alternating between brooding silence and irritable pacing on his crutches, until Florence threatened to hide them if he didn't rest his leg as the doctor had instructed. Late afternoon finally brought the sound of approaching riders. Florence helped Miles to the porch, where they watched Jake leading a small herd of cattle back toward the ranch, flanked by the men who had ridden out with him that morning. They got them back, Florence said with relief, noting that all the riders appeared unharmed. Miles nodded, his keen eyes counting the returned cattle. Looks like all 30 head, and he squinted against the setting sun. They've got prisoners, 3 men bound to their saddles. Jake rode ahead of the others, pulling up at the porch with a satisfied expression. Mission accomplished, boss. Found them holed up right where we thought. They weren't expecting us so soon and surrendered quick enough once they saw we had them outnumbered. Any trouble? Miles asked. One tried to run. Took a bullet in the leg for his effort, but he'll live to stand trial. Miles nodded approvingly. Good work, Jake. Have Charlie ride to Wasco and fetch Sheriff Hayes to collect the prisoners. The rest of you get those cattle back with the main herd. As Jake rode off to relay the orders, Miles turned to Florence with obvious relief. That could have gone much worse. Jake handled it perfectly. Your trust in him was well placed, Florence agreed, watching the men efficiently directing the recovered cattle toward the home pastures. Later that evening, after the sheriff had collected the rustlers and the excitement had died down, Florence found Miles in his study, staring thoughtfully at a framed map of Starlight Ranch that hung on the wall. You should be resting, she chided gently. It's been an eventful day. Miles didn't turn from the map. I've been thinking, he said, his voice reflective, about how differently today might have ended if you hadn't been here. Florence moved to stand beside him. What do you mean? If I'd been alone when that horse rolled on me, I might have died out there before the men found me. If you hadn't insisted we wait until morning to pursue the rustlers, Jake might have ridden into an ambush in the dark. He finally looked at her, his expression earnest. You've brought more to Starlight than just household management, Florence. The simple acknowledgement touched her deeply. I've only done what seemed sensible. Which is precisely what I've needed, Miles said quietly. Someone sensible, Someone who sees things clearly when I'm too close to them. He hesitated, then added, someone who makes this house feel like a home. Florence's heart quickened at his words. Miles, a sudden commotion outside interrupted them, excited voices calling out and the sound of a wagon approaching at speed. Now what? Miles muttered, reaching for his crutches. They made their way to the front door just as Tom came hurrying up the steps. "It's Mrs. Hattie," he announced, his expression bemused. "Says she couldn't stay away knowing you were laid up, boss. Came back on the afternoon stage to Wasco." Sure enough, the familiar figure of Mrs. Hattie was descending from a wagon driven by Charlie, her practical carpetbag clutched in one hand, as she scolded the young man for driving too recklessly over the rutted road. "Land sakes, if that isn't just like a man," she declared as she caught sight of Miles on his crutches. "Leave you alone for a few weeks, and you go and break yourself like a careless child." Despite her gruff words, genuine concern shone in her eyes as she climbed the steps and subjected Miles to a thorough visual inspection. "Mrs. Hattie," Miles greeted her, a rare smile lighting his face. "What about your grandchildren in Dallas? They'll keep," she sniffed. "My daughter wrote that you'd been injured. Couldn't very well stay away knowing Florence here is trying to run this place and nurse you back to health all by herself." Florence stepped forward to embrace the older woman warmly. "We've missed you terribly, Mrs. Hattie, but you didn't need to cut your visit short. We're managing." "Of course you are," Mrs. Hattie said, patting Florence's cheek. "But 4 hands are better than 2, especially when one of you is hobbling around like a 3-legged calf." She eyed Miles's cast critically. "Doctor says 6 weeks, I reckon. 4 more to go," Miles confirmed with a grimace. "Well then, best get you inside before you fall over. You're white as a sheet, which means you've been overdoing it already." With Mrs. Hattie's return, the rhythm of life at Starlight adjusted once more. The older woman slipped back into her role with practiced ease, though she made it clear that Florence remained the mistress of the household. Together, they created a system that allowed Florence time to assist Miles with ranch business while ensuring the domestic affairs ran smoothly. Mrs. Hattie also brought with her the latest news and gossip from town, including information about Judge Parker's imminent return with the promised books. "Says he's got 3 crates of novels and such," she told Florence as they prepared supper one evening. "Coming through Wasco day after tomorrow. Thought you might want to ride in and pick first like Mr. Vance arranged." Florence brightened at the prospect. "I'd love to, but," she glanced toward Miles's study, where he was reviewing cattle sale contracts. "I'm not sure I should leave Miles." Mrs. Hattie's knowing gaze followed Florence's. "I believe that husband of yours managed just fine before you came along, dear, and I'm perfectly capable of looking after him for a day." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Besides, absence makes the heart grow fonder, they say." Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mrs. Hattie, our arrangement pshaw," the older woman interrupted. "I've got eyes in my head, girl. Whatever arrangement you two started with has changed considerably these past months." She nodded toward Florence's left hand, where Miles's mother's ring gleamed in the lamplight. "That's not just for show anymore, unless I miss my guess." Rather than deny the observation, which would have been futile given Mrs. Hattie's perceptiveness, Florence simply said, "It's complicated." "Love usually is," Mrs. Hattie replied matter-of-factly, "but it's worth the complications." The next morning, Florence approached Miles about the trip to Wasco. To her surprise, he not only approved but insisted she take the opportunity. "You haven't left Starlight in months," he pointed out. "A day in town would do you good. Jake can drive you in the buggy, stay overnight, and bring you back tomorrow." "Are you certain you'll be all right?" Florence asked. "Mrs. Hattie is capable, but I'm much more mobile now," Miles assured her, demonstrating by walking a few steps on his crutches. "And I promise not to attempt any cattle roundups while you're gone." Florence laughed at the image. "See that you don't. I'd hate to return to find you've undone all your healing." The following morning, Florence departed for Wasco with Jake, feeling both excited about the prospect of new books and strangely reluctant to leave Miles, even for a day. As the ranch disappeared behind them, she found herself already looking forward to returning. Wasco had changed little since Florence had last seen it, the dusty main street lined with the same weathered buildings. Yet her perspective had shifted dramatically. Where once she had seen only a rough frontier town offering no opportunities, she now recognized a growing community with its own unique character and charm. Judge Parker greeted her warmly at the hotel where he was staying, proudly showing her the crates of books donated by a ladies' literary society in St. Louis. "Mrs. Vance," he said, using her married title with obvious approval, "I'm delighted to see you looking so well." "Ranch life agrees with you, it seems." "It does," Florence confirmed, realizing the truth of the statement as she spoke it. "Starlight has become home in ways I never anticipated." The judge's eyes twinkled knowingly. "And Miles, he's treating you well, very well," Florence assured him. "Though he's currently recovering from a broken leg sustained during the recent storm." As they sorted through the books, Judge Parker shared news of developments throughout the county and state. Florence was surprised by how interested she had become in matters affecting Texas ranchers' water rights, railroad expansion, and changes in cattle markets that would impact Starlight's operations. When the judge mentioned a proposed spur line that might bring the railroad within 15 miles of the ranch, instead of the current 30, Florence immediately recognized the potential benefits for their cattle business. She asked detailed questions about the timeline and requirements that clearly impressed the judge. "You've become quite the rancher's wife," he observed. "Miles is fortunate to have found a partner who takes such an interest in his business affairs." Florence smiled at the characterization. "Partners" had become their preferred description of their relationship, one that acknowledged mutual respect and contribution, without addressing the more complicated emotional aspects that had developed. After selecting several promising volumes for herself, and noting which books might be suitable for the ranch hands who enjoyed reading during the quiet winter months, Florence made a few additional purchases in town. A new pipe for Miles, whose old one had cracked, peppermint sticks for Mrs. Hattie, who had a secret sweet tooth, and fabric for curtains in the parlor, which needed refreshing before winter set in. She spent the night at Wasco's small hotel, finding it strange to sleep in a bed other than her own at Starlight. Despite her comfortable room, Florence found herself missing the familiar sounds of the ranch at night, the distant lowing of cattle, the chorus of insects, the occasional whinny from the horses in the corral. Most of all, she missed Miles. Their evening conversations had become a cherished ritual, and the day felt incomplete without that quiet time together. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, Florence finally admitted to herself what she had been avoiding for weeks. She wanted their marriage to be real in every sense. The question was whether Miles might want the same. Florence and Jake departed Wasco early the next morning, the buggy loaded with books and purchases. As they approached Starlight in the late afternoon, Florence felt a surge of happiness at the sight of the whitewashed house gleaming in the autumn sunlight. This was home now, in a way Boston had ceased to be even before her parents' deaths. Miles was on the porch when they arrived, leaning on one crutch but looking considerably steadier than when she had left. His face brightened visibly at the sight of her, and Florence felt an answering warmth bloom in her chest. "Welcome back," he called as Jake helped her down from the buggy. "How was your literary expedition?" "Successful beyond my hopes," Florence replied, moving up the steps to join him. Judge Parker had everything from Shakespeare to the latest novels from back east. Mrs. Hattie appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did you remember my peppermints, dear?" Florence laughed, producing the paper bag of candy. "As if I would dare return without them." The easy camaraderie of homecoming continued through supper, with Florence describing her visit to town and the news Judge Parker had shared. Miles listened intently to her report on the proposed railroad spur, asking pertinent questions that Florence was now knowledgeable enough to answer. "You've become quite the businesswoman," he remarked with obvious pride. "Tom says your work with the accounts has been exemplary." "I enjoy it," Florence admitted. "There's satisfaction in seeing how all the pieces fit together: expenses, income, planning for future needs." Mrs. Hattie exchanged a knowing glance with Miles that Florence couldn't quite interpret before announcing she was retiring early. "These old bones need rest. You two young folks enjoy the evening." Once the housekeeper had gone upstairs, Miles suggested they move to the porch for their customary evening conversation. The night was cool but not cold, the first hints of autumn crispness refreshing after the lingering heat of summer. "I missed this," Miles said once they were settled in their usual chairs. "The ranch seemed incomplete without you here." The simple admission sent a thrill through Florence. "I missed it too. Found myself longing for home most of yesterday, which is strange considering how briefly I've lived at Starlight." "Not strange at all," Miles disagreed quietly. "Some places just fit, like they were waiting for you to arrive." Florence nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I never expected to feel that way about Texas. It seemed so alien when I first arrived: the vastness, the heat, the unfamiliar landscape. And now I can't imagine being anywhere else." She gazed out at the star-studded sky spreading endlessly above them. "There's a freedom here I never knew in Boston, a sense of possibility." Miles was watching her face, his expression thoughtful in the soft lamplight spilling from the parlor windows. "You've changed since you arrived." "Grown stronger, more confident." "Necessity is an effective teacher," Florence replied with a small smile, "though I had good instructors as well." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with the night sounds of the ranch, distant coyotes, the rustle of wind through autumn dry grass, the occasional soft nicker from the horse corral. "Florence," Miles began hesitantly, breaking the silence. "I've been thinking a great deal during my convalescence about our arrangement." Florence's heart quickened, though she kept her expression neutral. "Oh," Miles shifted in his chair, clearly choosing his words with care. "When we married, we agreed to a practical partnership. A solution to our respective problems." "Yes," Florence acknowledged, unsure where he was leading. "The thing is," Miles continued, his voice gaining certainty, "arrangements change, people change." He looked directly at her now. "Feelings change." Florence hardly dared breathe, afraid to hope yet unable to stop herself. "What are you saying, Miles?" Instead of answering immediately, Miles struggled to his feet, balancing on his good leg with the aid of his crutch. He moved to stand before her chair, then, in an awkward but determined movement, lowered himself to one knee, wincing slightly as the position strained his injured leg. "Miles, your leg," Florence began, alarmed. "Is fine," he interrupted firmly. "This is more important." He took her hand in his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Florence Sullivan Vance, when you proposed our marriage of convenience, I thought I was getting a housekeeper with a wedding ring. What I received instead was a partner, a confidante, and a woman who has brought light back into a life I hadn't realized had grown dark." Florence felt tears gathering in her eyes as Miles continued. I know this isn't what you bargained for. You agreed to wed for a roof overhead, nothing more. But I find myself hoping, praying that you might consider accepting something additional. His voice grew husky with emotion. My heart, Florence, imperfect and cautious as it is, it belongs to you now if you want it. Joy, pure and overwhelming, surged through Florence. Miles, she whispered, squeezing his hand tightly. I've been afraid to tell you how my feelings have changed, worried it would complicate our arrangement. Hope lit Miles's face. And how have they changed? Florence reached out to touch his cheek, a caress she had long denied herself. I came to Starlight seeking shelter, but I found a home. I married you for security, but I've discovered love instead. Her voice caught on the word she had been avoiding for so long. I love you, Miles Vance. Not for what you provided when I was desperate, but for who you are, the man I've come to know these past months. Miles surged forward despite his injured leg, capturing her lips with his in a kiss, unlike the chaste peck they had shared at their wedding. This was a kiss of genuine passion, of promises long delayed, of feelings finally acknowledged. When they eventually parted, both breathless, Miles rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Florence. Have for weeks now, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself. Florence smiled, helping him rise and settle back in his chair, though this time she perched on the arm beside him, unwilling to put even that small distance between them. When did you know? She asked curiously. Miles considered the question. There wasn't one moment, he said finally. It was countless small things. The way you tackled each new challenge without complaint, your kindness to the hands, finding you reading in my study that night, completely absorbed in a book about Texas wildflowers of all things. He smiled at the memory. But if I had to choose one moment when I couldn't deny it any longer, it was watching you take charge after my injury, seeing how perfectly you fit here, not just in my house but in my life. And I thought I was being so professional, Florence said with a soft laugh. All the while falling hopelessly in love with my husband. Miles pulled her closer, his arm strong around her waist. We've done everything backwards, haven't we? Most couples fall in love, then marry. We married, then fell in love. I think our way might be better, Florence mused. We built a foundation first: trust, respect, friendship. The love grew from solid ground. Wise as always, Mrs. Vance. Miles pressed a kiss to her temple. So where do we go from here? Florence smiled, suddenly remembering something. I think I know the first step. She rose and went inside, returning moments later with Mrs. Hattie's wedding quilt, carefully unfolded in her arms. Perhaps it's time this found its proper place. Miles's eyes darkened with understanding and desire. Are you suggesting what I think you are? I'm suggesting that a husband and wife who love each other should share more than just evening conversations, Florence replied, newfound boldness overcoming her natural reticence. Though your leg will require us to be creative for a few more weeks. Miles laughed, the sound rich with joy and promise. Have I mentioned how much I admire your practical problem-solving abilities, Mrs. Vance? Later that night, as they lay together beneath Mrs. Hattie's starry quilt, Miles pulled Florence close against his side, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. When I was a boy, he said softly, my father used to tell me that a man's wealth wasn't measured in cattle or land, but in the love he carried with him. I didn't understand then. Florence pressed a kiss to his chest, directly over his heart. And now I know he was right, Miles replied, his voice husky with emotion. I thought I was offering you shelter when you needed it most, a roof overhead in exchange for your help. He tilted her face up to his, eyes shining with love in the moonlight spilling through the window. But you've given me so much more, Florence. You agreed to wed for a roof overhead. What I never told you was that with me, you'd get the sky too, all of it, stars and clouds and storms together. A life that's bigger and wilder and more beautiful than either of us could have built alone. Florence smiled, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. The roof and the sky, she whispered. Perfect complements, like us. Miles kissed her then, sealing their new understanding with a tenderness that spoke of all the years stretching before them, years of partnership, passion, and love on the land they both now called home. And outside their window, the vast Texas sky spread endlessly above Starlight Ranch, stars bearing silent witness to promises finally spoken, and a love that had grown from the most practical of beginnings into something neither had dared hope for, but both had found. 1 year later, Florence stood on the porch of Starlight Ranch, watching the first bluebonnets of spring transform the hillsides into a sea of blue. The sight never failed to take her breath away, even after a full cycle of seasons on the ranch. But this spring felt particularly significant, a marker of how far she had come since that desperate day in Wasco, when she had proposed marriage to a stranger. Beautiful, isn't it? Miles's voice came from behind her as he stepped out to join his wife, wrapping his arms around her expanding waistline. His hands rested protectively over the swell of their child, due to arrive by midsummer. Perfect, Florence agreed, leaning back against his solid strength. Hard to believe that a year ago, I'd never seen Texas wildflowers in bloom. Miles pressed a kiss to her temple. Hard to believe a year ago we were still pretending our marriage was merely practical. Florence laughed, turning in his arms to face him. We were rather foolish, weren't we? Cautious, Miles corrected with a smile, but thankfully not too stubborn to recognize happiness when it found us. The sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. Mrs. Hattie was returning from her winter visit with her daughter in Dallas, timing her arrival to coincide with the birth of the first Vance child. Right on schedule, Miles observed, helping Florence down the porch steps to greet their dear friend, Mrs. Hattie's face lit up at the sight of Florence's condition. Land sakes, look at you, blooming brighter than those bluebonnets. As Miles helped the older woman down from the wagon, she cast a knowing glance between the couple. Seems like that quilt I made is serving its purpose nicely, she remarked with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. Florence blushed, but Miles merely laughed and kissed Mrs. Hattie's weathered cheek. It's been keeping us warm in more ways than one. Later that evening, with Mrs. Hattie settled back into her familiar room and the ranch quiet after supper, Florence and Miles took their customary places on the porch. The ritual had remained unchanged through the seasons of their marriage, a time for connection after busy days spent tending to their growing enterprise. Starlight Ranch had prospered over the past year. The railroad spur Florence had learned about in Wasco had indeed been built, reducing the distance to market and increasing their profit margins considerably. Miles had expanded their breeding program with Florence's encouragement, introducing superior bloodlines that were already improving their herd. I've been thinking, Miles said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, about names for the baby. Florence smiled, resting a hand on her rounded belly where their child had been particularly active all day. I was wondering when we'd have this conversation. If it's a boy, I'd like to name him Sullivan, Miles suggested. After your family, Sullivan Vance has a distinguished sound to it. Touched by the gesture, Florence nodded. I'd like that very much. And if it's a girl, Hope, Miles said without hesitation, because that's what she'll represent, all the hope and promise that brought us together and keeps us looking toward the future. Sullivan or Hope Vance, Florence tested the names aloud. Perfect either way. Miles reached over to take her hand, his expression growing more serious. "I never thanked you properly, you know." "For what?" "For being brave enough to propose our unusual arrangement that day in Wasco. If you hadn't approached my wagon, hadn't taken that risk." He shook his head, the thought clearly troubling him. "Our lives would have been so much poorer." Florence squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Perhaps it was fate, or divine providence. I was at the end of my rope. You needed someone to share your life, and somehow we found each other at exactly the right moment." "Providence or not, I'm grateful every day," Miles said softly. "You came looking for shelter, and I hope you found that and more here at Starlight." "So much more," Florence assured him, her voice warm with love. "A purpose, a partnership, a family." She guided his hand to where their child kicked vigorously. "And yes, a home beneath both roof and sky, just as you promised." Miles smiled at the reference to words spoken on their wedding night, when they had finally acknowledged the love that had grown between them. "The sky's the limit for us now, Florence Vance. For you, me, and this little one on the way." As darkness fell over Starlight Ranch, the couple remained on their porch, hands intertwined, watching as stars appeared one by one in the vast Texas sky that had witnessed their unusual beginning. And now shone down on their shared future, a future neither could have imagined when a desperate young woman agreed to wed for a roof overhead, and discovered that, with that bargain, came the immeasurable gift of the boundless sky, and the man who had taught her to love it as he did.